on more tools that we will be coming up with, short leaflets, decision makers toolkits, and so on. But in the meantime, we're going to look at what the issues are that arise out of the study and what it means for our understanding of COVID disinformation and disinformation more broadly. So to start with, we have Julie Possetti, as I said, co-led the authoring of the study. She's the Director of Research for the International Centre of Journalists, and she's also a senior researcher at the Centre for Freedom of the Media, University of Sheffield in the UK, and a research associate of the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford in the UK. So Julie, please give us the quick overview of this research, and then we're going to jump into our discussions. Over to you, Julie.
Thanks very much, Guy. And just bear with me while I get my slideshow ready here. As Guy said, I'm a researcher, but also a journalist, and I come at these issues from those perspectives. So as we all know, COVID-19 has led to a parallel crisis, a pandemic of disinformation that has directly impacted on all of us, really, on our health and our ability to access reliable information. And one of the reasons we pivoted, as Guy said, during the work on the big study to produce two smaller policy briefs on the disinfodemic was that we were seeing the ways in which COVID-19 related disinformation were potentially, or elements of it were so potentially deadly, and so in confusion about the policy choices and the personal safety choices we were making. So within these three pieces of work, we're addressing, as Guy said, the entire spectrum of disinformation responses. And what's original about this is that we're looking at the target of interventions rather than the individual actors, if you like, and assessing the responses as well, importantly, in terms of freedom of expression implications. And we've seen a range of risks associated with freedom of expression erosion as a result of some of the more extreme responses to disinformation during the COVID period. It's also this body of work underpinning these studies geographically diverse. Very much hard work was put into trying to represent voices from the global south in particular. And particularly with these disinfodemic briefs, our objective was, we said, to try and flatten the curve of COVID-19 disinformation. So let me take you through some of the key points here. Just going to fiddle with my screen a bit so I can see what I'm doing as well. So important distinction to make. We're calling this a disinfodemic, not an infodemic per se. The reason for that is because the infodemic, as it was expressed originally by the World Health Organization, refers to this tsunami of information, both information, incredible content, and false information, disinformation and misinformation. So we have coined the term disinfodemic to represent this combination of disinformation and misinformation. And the reason we're using disinformation quite generally as an umbrella term for both misinformation and disinformation is because misinformation is often seeded when it goes viral by acts of disinformation. The other point to note that influenced that decision to use disinformation generically was the reality that much of the false and misleading information we're seeing in connection with COVID-19 is extremely damaging potentially and also possibly deadly. So the effects of this disinformation or false and misleading content are likely to be the same regardless of whatever the intent was behind the creation and distribution of it. So with the disinfodemic briefs, we identified 9 key themes that were associated with the disinfodemic, and we developed this, this typology of themes, if you like, on the basis of an examination of databases that were being kept by the International Fact-Checking Network, and also we were influenced by the work of First Draft, and Claire Wardell is on this panel discussion and will be able, I'm sure, to provide additional insights based on their own analysis. But you can see on the screen there 9 different types. So the idea of the origins and the spread of coronavirus being manipulated, often for political reasons, statistical manipulation and decontextualization, much false and misleading content connected to economic impacts. One really dangerous situation has evolved with regard to the targeting of journalists in the context of disinformation campaigns, which have escalated in the context of COVID-19. Medical and scientific related disinformation, which of course goes to the very nature of the disease and how it manifests, impacts on society and the environment. The one that I'll pay more attention to, politicization, which is also connected to these attacks on journalists that we mentioned earlier. So as much as there is an acceptance by many states and political actors of COVID-19's factual basis and responses to it are in accordance with that, there has been a real attempt to politicize using the tools of disinformation. And content that's been driven by fraudulent financial gain, along with celebrity-focused disinformation. We also identified 4 key formats of disinformation, so the ways in which this content was being distributed. Emotional narrative constructs and memes, fabricated websites and authoritative identities, so trying to mislead people by creating false authorities and false websites, including websites purporting to be news sites, along with decontextualized images and videos that sometimes are also altered or fabricated, and those actors seeking to infiltrate networks or seed orchestrated campaigns. So those were the 4 main formats. Beyond that, we developed a typology of COVID-19 disinformation responses. And that typology essentially follows the identification and monitoring of disinformation. It looks at the producers and distributors of disinformation, along with then the production and distribution mechanisms, and the support that's offered the audiences who are the targets of disinformation. We had, in the context of the COVID-19 disinfodemic analysis, then subcategorized 10 different types of response, which we extended to 11 different types in the context of the Broadband Commission and UNESCO report Balancing Act. And the reason for that was that we added to that an element under the category of responses aimed at producers and distributors that emphasized electoral responses. And of course, we're in a situation now where we have, I think, a great need to emphasize electoral responses in the context of the US election. And interestingly, with election or electoral responses, taking it to 11 subcategories of these responses, these are often designed to detect and track and counter disinformation that is spread during elections. So this separate category was designed in recognition of the threats to democracy and electoral processes and citizens' rights associated with disinformation. So I guess based on that, it's important to also think about the distinctions and intersections or overlaps between COVID-19 disinformation and political disinformation. So as you can see there, we have the situation that COVID is genuinely global, whereas political disinformation is often specific to individual states or regions. Although we are seeing trends towards global issues related to the sort of polarization based on populist politics. COVID-19 disinformation is massive in scale, and it tends to jump across internet services or sites or apps. It's resulted in swifter and more decisive responses from internet communications companies, but this has raised, as I said, issues around challenges to freedom of expression and the potential erosion of international rights to freedom of expression and privacy and so on. And as I said, populist, divisive political actors are continuing to politicize these issues, which undermines to an extent the cross-party agreement that we saw earlier on in the crisis in reference to managing and responding to COVID-19. Also, just a data point from a recent study that I ran with Emily Bell and Pete Brown from the Tao Center at Columbia University, which I think adds some texture to this. We surveyed over 1,400 English-speaking journalists, and we found from very diverse geographic locations, and we found substantial evidence of political leaders and elected officials being identified as the main sources of disinformation, which correlates with other research that's been done in reference to audiences. So we can see that, I think, as a feature that should feed into responses and recommendations. So just to highlight a few of the recommendations now that we made, both within the Broadband Commission Balancing Act.
Sorry to interrupt, Julie, if you could just skip some of the non-key ones and give us, because we're going to move on.
Yeah, all right, thanks. Hard to time keep on a Zoom with no clock. I think probably the point to highlight is that there is a 23-step freedom of expression tool to assess responses to disinformation in the Broadband Commission book, which we'd encourage people to delve into and to apply. It's a very practical response. And I think the recommendation to states, to political actors of all sorts, to avoid engaging in political disinformation tactics, which is an ongoing problem. We have to address the source of this problem, along with a couple of recommendations aimed at the internet communications companies, number one being to apply fact-checking to all political content and to ensure transparency and independence with regard to their interventions, particularly with regard to funding. And I think I'll leave it there, but all of these recommendations, there's something like 85 of them, I think, are available in the documents that Guy's already shared. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Julie. So I think that gives you a nice perspective of the key categories, insights in this and some of the recommendations, and also shows you the overlap between COVID disinformation, political disinformation, how what we learn from the one space could have relevance to the other space, especially when these issues are being combined. So let's move on to our speakers now, and our first speaker is Tina Pernat. Tina is Technical Officer in Digital Health Technologies at the World Health Organization. Of course, she and her colleagues have been right at the forefront of this issue, carrying the brunt of the infodemic, because it impacts so much on the work that they do on the ground in terms of people's behavior. And so let's just start off by asking Tina about just one or two, or maybe three, of the major efforts made by World Health Organization to counter misinformation and disinformation connected to COVID-19.
Thank you, Guy, very much for this opportunity. So yes, I mean, as both Julie and you have pointed out, in public health space, when we're looking at the infodemic, we really are concerned both with the too much information and also false or misleading information, both in the digital and the physical environment. Because what we experience during public health emergencies is that all of this can lead to confusion or risk-taking and behaviors that can harm health. And then, of course, can potentially lead to mistrust in health authorities or public health response. What we are seeing is that increasingly misinformation and disinformation mirror pandemics, and infodemics can really intensify or lengthen outbreaks if enough people change their behavior based on misinformation or lack of trust. So we recognized early on in the pandemic that we need to really think through and consult across all of society already in April how we can step together in order to respond to the infodemic. The results of that April consultation actually resulted in a framework for managing infodemics and 50 actions that all parts of society can do to help respond to the infodemic. What we really feel is that infodemic response requires a whole of society response, and this includes health authorities, fact checkers, civil society organizations, academia, social media and tech sector, scientific journals, media and journalists. A couple of examples, Guy. One is definitely a partnership with social media and the tech sector to promote placements of high quality content, health information online, including building of chatbots and other tools. We also partnered up with the UN Secretary General's office, supporting the Verify campaign, for example, which was designed to build awareness among the public about the circulating health misinformation, and promoting citizens' skills to take pause before they share information. And we've partnered up with other agencies such as UNESCO and UN Global Pulse and ITU, both on media and journalism trainings and use of data science for better monitoring and evaluation of infodemic response and reaching communities through a variety of channels. Now, in the spirit of whole of society response, really what we've seen is needed and for response now in the next step is operationalizing the response. So, for example, in the African continent, WHO Regional Office for Africa stepped together with a variety of partners, UN organizations, fact checkers, and other operational partners to really put together an infrastructure and a collaboration that would allow a much more nimble response to misinformation. This is something that hasn't been done before. We're building the ship as we're flying it, and it's a really significant response, a whole society response. What we also recognize is that we need to build a workforce. We need to build up skills for infodemic response across all of society, but also in the health sector. So we're just running an infodemic manager training that is extremely multidisciplinary in nature, really looking at what is the evidence and what kind of interventions grounded in communities, looking at people, human-centered, can help us build resilience to misinformation. And then, of course, recognizing this, coming up in December, we're taking stock at the next whole of society conference on infodemic management, where we really need to chart out next steps in the response going into 2021. Really how to promote health behaviors, but then also build resilience to misinformation. And I'm really pleased that all of the talks that are following this one, because all of us have a role to play, and all of our perspectives can come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. And just a quick follow-up. So I understand you've got this perspective of the infodemic, and what you want to do is to increase the supply of quality content and the visibility of verified content and combat the disinformation and the misinformation. So you at World Health Organization, you're creating a kind of a field, a research field called infobemiology. And you've had that one conference, and now, as you mentioned, you're going to have another conference in December. I mean, what can you tell us about how it actually works on the ground? So people are involved in exposure to some content, and some of it is good, and some of it is damaging. How are people actually reconciling that? And what are you finding with your evidence? Because that affects how we're going to respond.
Yes, I mean, one major consideration when we're thinking about how does health misinformation affect people's behavior, there are actually, there's no comprehensive review or evidence informing this. There's still a lot to learn about what actually, what is the connection between people receiving information, having an intent to act, and then actually act in a certain way. This is one of the reasons why we feel that we've brought together a variety of scientific disciplines over the summer to develop a public health research agenda for infodemic management. Because really, we cannot assume that by merely providing information to people that will result in health behaviors. There's such a variety of factors that affect people's people's decision to act or to share misinformation, that we really need to understand what affects this, and any interventions and skill building and building resilience needs to really happen at the individual and community level. This is something that is very challenging because we all experience infodemics very locally in our personal lives, in professional lives, in our communities. And this is really where the response needs to be located. But this requires definitely a retooling, rethinking of how we respond. And at the same time, how we ensure a much more nimble feedback and react from what we learn from communities, both online and offline, meaning quite a lot of operational research that then feeds immediately into response by health authorities, by fact checkers, by media partners to promote information to respond, debunking, for example, or other interventions that would respond to the infodemic. So a lot of things still need to be learned, but what is very clear is that we need to really put people at the center, communities at the center, ensure participatory co-creation, both of understanding of interventions, but actually also a co-design of what actually is important to people in the communities to inform them how do we respond to locally to the infodemics. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Tina, and it's something that Claire Wardell likes to underline, that it's, information is the tip of the iceberg. You've got all the emotion underneath that. You've got the community norms. You've got the family relationships. And so we're going to tackle this. The informational level is really important, but not the only part of the equation. And I think your research is pointing out that kind of issue. Let's move on to our next speaker, Biban Kidron. Biban is a filmmaker, and she's also the chair of the Five Rights Foundation. And she was a commissioner. She serves a commissioner on the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. And she was in the working group that oversaw this UNESCO study, the one that Julie was introducing us to. So, Biban, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
I know that you see that there's a gap in the study, a children's point of view on disinformation, and how disinformation can impact in young people, especially in relation to COVID. What's your comment about this? Because how do we understand COVID disinformation, not only as an adult relevant phenomenon, but impacting on children, young people?
Thank you, Guy. Thank you very much. And I have to sort of echo your words that at 300 pages, this is indeed a very rich study, and there is much to get your arms around. So my concern throughout the pandemic really has been about the way that children are largely forgotten in the disinformation debate. They are a demographic most likely to get information online. They don't have a habit of traditional news media. In fact, I'm doing my own personal study, and I spend an awful lot of time with teenagers, and I always ask, do you ever read the newspaper? And they look at me blankly. They don't have money to get behind paywalls. So some of the information, some of the good information is not accessible to them. And I think on the whole, I know we are finding out that on the whole, they have quite a poor information diet. And actually, it's something that they themselves are very anxious about. And I think that, when you see this play out in the pandemic, that, there was a wonderful moment in, I think it was about April, where there was one report from the Pew Center, another from the Center for Disease Control, and sort of, in the intersection of the two reports say, those who see most health conspiracies are least likely to social distance and wash hands. If you map that against children and young people's media habits, here they are in this intersection. They were also sent a false message of a kind, a grain of truth message, that it doesn't affect them. So we have this other piece of information, and then they are in this sort of toxic place where they believe things they shouldn't believe, think that they're immune, don't do the necessary, and take that disease home. And think about the responsibility of that and the problems of that. And I think, moreover, this is not going to be our last health crisis, is it? And what we're teaching is a whole generation not to believe. So whatever lives it's costing now, I think there's a long tail of this, and it doesn't sit in a vacuum. And one of the things that pre-COVID I was at pains to point out, which is, who are the real victims of the anti-vax movement? Children. Yeah. And even that is not played out from their perspective. So, an informed society may not always translate into a healthy society, but I feel it's the best chance we have. And I think if we sacrifice the plurality of verified and authored information, that sort of confusion and doubt that I'm referring to is the result. And I do want to do a shout out to Julie and her colleagues, because I thought that it was very, very strong, the report on the role of journalists. And I think that we have to look at the decimation of that community, of the news community, as one part of this picture, because at some sense, the free speech justification to avoid responsibility for responding swiftly and decisively to disinformation has, in one sense, undermined the freedom of the press and the usefulness of the press to all of us. And then I just want to perhaps say one very brief thing, brief observation. And I was really, I really hear loud and clear from Tina the whole society approach, and clearly, that's true with most problems of this scale. It must be true. We all have a part to play. And that is also sort of reflected in the 80 recommendations of the report. But while we must defend any single person freedom to speak, I don't think we can quite say that about the right to package up and sell and spread, particularly when packaged as entertainment, bad information. And I think that this separation between the spread and the host of information and the creation of information is something that we could perhaps spend more of our time worrying about. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you.
I have two quick follow-up questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, so what to do about it? And the study, of course, is proposing media and information literacy. And a lot of people say, oh, well, everybody just needs more digital literacy, whatever that may mean. So to the extent that one can really educate, particularly young people, about dealing with this complicated communications environment, I mean, what are the top competencies that you think that young people need?
So I think you're right. It is something that people kind of grab off the shelf. Yeah. It doesn't work, so let's educate them to be clever about it. And I think it is a really important principle that we don't design a system that's toxic and make the solution that prepubescent kids have to make nuanced decisions beyond their capability. That is a no-no. Having said that, I actually think we do need to move to a place which is actually about a data literacy, a systems literacy, a literacy about automated systems, algorithmic and human bias, paid for content, visual literacy, checking authorship, checking sources, and very importantly, checking who paid for information. I'd like to see that as a marker on the spread of information. Who paid for it? So I think there are things that can be learned. And in fact, in my role at Five Rights, I actually spend quite a lot of time with young children doing data literacy workshops, and they become very, very sophisticated about understanding all sorts of problems. But I absolutely insist that is not a solution. That is something we need in the 21st century, alongside, maths and, language and numeracy skills.
And well, I have to ask you one last question. I mean, when one is growing up, you're still forming your identity. Your emotions are really being developed. You don't necessarily know who you are yet. You're kind of vulnerable to all kinds of messaging and nudges and ideas of this and what is fashionable and what is beautiful, and et cetera, and so disinformation comes into this mix, and it can reinforce racism, can reinforce sexism. So, I mean, help us just unpack in terms of the harmful, potentially harmful content that young people are exposed to. What's the disinformational component as opposed to this emotional identity component? Does it have its own effect? For example, you gave the COVID thing. How does that play so we get this grounded perspective, like Tina was saying, the infobemiology perspective?
I'm not sure I can do as good a job as Tina did, but let me sort of almost quote the report back. It makes a really very important point towards the end, and it talks about how, you know, that you can't really absolutely separate out the health disinformation from the political disinformation, from the climate change disinformation, and so on. And what it starts to do, you know, is say, hang on, you know, there's people and planet as well as profit. It doesn't put it like that. Those are that's my language. I'm, you know, but it does make that point in a very cool way. And I think you've got to look at that, about the industrial levels of self-harm, about pro-anus stuff, incitements to suicide, you know, the violent porn into the hands of 8-year-olds. Why are these not a health crisis? I've been saying that's a health crisis for a number of years. And in the context of childhood, I think some of it is disinformation. Now, I am a very, very keen advocate for free speech. And I am not suggesting we block and ban stuff like that. I am just saying, host it where you want, don't put it in the hands of kids, you know, without them even inviting it. And so I'm sort of making my same point again and saying, I think that the pandemic, you know, it has been a miserable time, but we must learn the lessons. And the lessons are very profound. And if we follow the pattern of health misinformation, some of the solutions that we find for that are solutions for these broader issues around what is misinformation in childhood. Yeah, you're muted, Guy.
Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, who I'm sure will be equally interesting. It's Wojciech Dmachowski-Lipski. He is Executive Secretary of the UTELSAT Intergovernmental Organization, and also a member of the Broadband Commission and a member of the working group that oversaw this research. So, Wojciech, we have heard BBAN warning that you should offload the problems onto the victims, as it were, for them to deal with the mess. You also, she said, she indicated you need some, I guess, protective measures without violating freedom of expression. So, I mean, you deal a lot with policy issues and so on, and not immediately in this space, but generally speaking. How do you see the role of policy and regulation in addressing this disinformation question, particularly around COVID, and in building public trust?
You just said the word, which is trust, and actually, it's I understand it's the main theme of this particular module of the IGF. We are dealing with issues pertaining to public policy, and public policy, just my opinion, cannot focus on just one crisis which we have had, right? We have to understand that there will be life after that. People actually said that, and was before that, which has shaped our culture, our legal systems, and so on. And if the societies and the plethora of different cultures and different societies, they create network of responses to this particular crisis, have to remember that whatever we put in the laws, whatever we put in the regulations, are gonna last, and for good or for bad. In the typology that the researchers that they put together this report that we endorsed, policy responses are kind of mostly focused on responses aimed at production and distribution of disinformation, and this is obviously truth, but it's actually more broader than that. States or entities that regulate our lives, governments, regulatory environment, laws, enforcement, all of that ancient Romans called as imperium, right now, in my opinion, are at crossroads, because we run a risk of creating a system that might not help this particular disinformation epidemics and pandemics in time before hopefully the vaccine is done, but will create a lot of harm for the future. And this has been recognized in the report, this broadly speaking, everything pertaining to freedom of speech, freedom of information. All the responses aimed at producers and distributors could basically be divided into two major methods or methodology. One is negative, it's basically prohibiting somebody from spreading the disinformation, affecting the platforms in a certain penal way, using penal codes and so on. And then there are also positive ways, like, for example, using state funds to promote fact-checking, to promote general awareness, and so on. And I think that, just to finish this first intervention, the principal question from somebody who's been involved in setting governmental policies is to recognize the possible effects for the future, as much as we are focused on actually fighting the crisis at hand. And we in the report say that it's better to organize and promote certain positive stimulus and certain positive ways of behavior, rather than focus only on regulating and enforcing new laws which may be too hasty and enacted too soon. I stop at that unless you have other questions.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting perspective, because normally we think of regulation as restriction, and you're saying there's also an enabling dimension. I know that another issue that is of interest to you is this question of culture and dealing with disinformation. So we've spoken a bit already about how information is part of a bigger human condition, which includes norms, communities, emotions, fears, aspirations, identities. And culture is not something that this report was really mentioned, but I'm intrigued as to why you think we need to understand culture in addressing the responses to disinformation, especially around COVID.
Yeah, I'm a little like Biban that I'm adding something to the report. I actually hope and recommend to everybody listening to actually read the report, which is very good, and kudos to those who went behind it. Let me start with this, before I jump to the culture thing. And this is actually which is in the report. There are certain constraints of the public policy response to this crisis, and taking into account possible ramifications into the future. First constraint is very technical, is that the pace of technology is faster than whatever the states and lawmakers and regulators can invent. And the second is the international dimension. And the international dimension actually brings me to the cultural aspect, because you can have in one society an approach toward the regulation, which is completely different from another. And the definitions of disinformation is different, and the approach, for example, whether to penalize or criminalize disinformation or not is different. So leaving COVID aside, let's say disinformation about the head of state. In one country is a right, constitutional right. In another is criminalized, but only punished with a certain like slap on the wrist or $100 fine. In another is carries death penalty. So how, in a global sense, can we create the right legislative or regulatory approach to spreading false news, even if, following on the previous speakers, even if we can define what is false or what is not, which is a task in itself. The answer to the question that I asked myself is we cannot, and this is exactly what I would call the cultural dimension or cultural environment. It depends on our set of beliefs. You know, I grew up in a country that for many years was governed by my oppressive communist system, and all the free speech could be and was on many occasions penalized, not as libel, not as disinformation, but basically not as political, excuse me, as political free speech, but as disinformation, which was not. So culture is very important because law itself, and we are talking about law, right? Mostly public policy, it's law. Both in terms of creating it and then enforcing it, but law stems from culture, and vice versa. So just to finish and to conclude, I myself find myself in a strange situation because I very much believe in public policy, and I think that we should do. Those of us who have something to do with public policy, who should do everything possible to help solve this crisis and not to create too much harm, but eventually the cultural changes that we actually witness in Europe and in other countries, most recently in United Arab Emirates, for example, or some other places, and in my native country, eventually those cultural changes will define public policy with regard to disinformation. And in the meantime, we have highly skilled technical people who are working day in and day out to make this job even more difficult for public policy creators.
Your mic, Guy.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. My mic is not working very well, but I think we will certainly hear from Stephen about the issues that you face when you're a technology communications company dealing with these different regimes and trying to have some respect for international standards, which are broad and have different culture. But let's move on before we come to Stephen, to Claire Wardell. So Claire is many things, but amongst others, she was an expert advisor on this study. And thank you, Claire, for all the time you put into giving advice to the researchers. She also, of course, is very well known as one of the founders of First Draft News, where she leads strategy and research. And so First Draft is a leading research agency looking at this whole phenomenon and how it's changing, and particularly does work to service the media in terms of how media can really play a better role in terms of covering this information. So Claire, tell us about how you do this and how media can cover the story without giving more oxygen to it.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you for inviting me onto this panel. And just to give more props to Julie and the team, I really couldn't believe it when it dropped and it was so long, and trying to get a handle on this topic because it shifts and morphs all the time, but it's really an excellent piece of work, and I think will be one of those kind of documents that will remain really relevant, because I think it was the concepts as opposed to the tactics and techniques, which, as Julie just explained, keep changing. So First Draft was founded in 2015 as simply a website to teach journalists how to verify images and videos online. But then a year later, in 2016, many people became interested in how do you verify what's true online. But our focus has always been media institutions as a key element in the information ecosystem. I will say that over the last year, we have recognized that the media is just one of many, many critical gatekeepers. And as we're seeing, there are many people in, unfortunately, many, many countries who no longer see the news media as gatekeepers. So we're now increasingly working with other organizations. But the challenge for the media is they need to be trusted by their audience. But there is now a reason why different governments, different politicians have a reason to undermine that trust. And the challenge for the news media is they've always had this paradigm of more sunlight is a disinfectant, that by shining a light on something, you are going to uncover truths. And that's at the core of journalism. The problem is that has been weaponized and used against the news media to be like, look at this shiny thing over here, come and report this. And journalists have kind of unfortunately been used increasingly over the last few years. And Julie is right. This is a tactic and a technique to deliberately manipulate the media into covering some of these rumors and conspiracies, which if the media didn't cover them, there is a chance that they wouldn't have that audience, because disinformation actors are actually relatively small in number and they don't really have an audience. They are only effective if they turn that or they create a process by which the disinformation turns into misinformation. When people believe it and share it, not realizing that it's false, not realizing that it's harmful. And the media is a critical element of the ecosystem. And as we've seen over the last 4 years in the country that I currently live in, which is the US, which is the media have been caught in a very difficult position, because the main driver of disinformation in the US has been the president and his administration. It's very, very difficult for the news media to say, we're not going to give oxygen to these rumors, because it's a story in itself. And so it has been an incredibly tough time. I think we are seeing many news media now grappling with what has happened over the last 4 years and how they move forward. As we've seen, there has been a determined effort, not just by Trump, but by leaders around the world, to undermine an independent media as a deliberate tactic. And academic research shows that when you ask people on the street, what's fake news? They say BBC, CNN, New York Times. They see these previously trusted organizations as being part of a system that is against them. And so where we go from here is critical. There's no, as Pierre just said, every country is different, every news ecosystem is different. I'm not making grand claims globally, but there are many, many worrying patterns in many countries around the world that suggest you have half the population turning to trusted news sites for information and half the population not. And that's absolutely playing out in the US right now. It's like two parallel realities. And that's I don't know where we come back from that, but it's a real worry where, the New York Times this week published a story after interviewing 50 secretaries of state to say, was there any examples of election fraud in your states? And of course, everybody said no. And the New York Times put it on the front page. I don't think there was any New York Times reader that was like, oh, thanks for letting me know. I wasn't sure. So how do we reach the 50% of the population that are not consuming the New York Times and believe the election was rigged? And so thinking through this, we can't keep having discussions about misinformation and disinformation as a problem of the platforms. Yes, it is. There is a lot of work to be done there. But if we don't think about how the media ecosystem fits within all of that, we're missing out. And to Tina, who is, I just have to point out, it's so exciting having Tina on this call. The work she's doing right now with the WHO, training up over 280 people in every country in the world, is just chef's kiss. So I just really want to say, there's a lot of people who talk about this. Tina is a doer. So I just want to say how great that is. But what she was saying about how do we root this in communities? How do we understand all of these different elements? It's platforms, it's news media, it's communities, it's governments. All of this has to be, we need to understand it. And to Pietro's point, it's different in every country. which makes this really, really hard, but critical to understand.
Thanks, Claire. Just one quick last question to you. So, because we're going to come to Stephen next. What, in your view, can internet companies and media actors do together, given that we've got this huge problem? I mean, internet companies are not completely neutral in this. More and more, they have to take some moderation and curational position. I mean, do you see a kind of more possibility for better relations, or I don't mean sweetheart relations, but I mean some kind of pooling forces in some way to really, make sure that verified information does the gossip, the rumor, the deliberate falsehoods, and the unintentional misleading information.
I mean, I'll start very quickly with talking about the platforms, because of course we've seen more action from the platforms in the last 3 months than we've seen in the last 10 years. And on one hand, I'm glad that we're seeing that, and this is a step forward in terms of there being a recognition that there can't just be a hands-off approach. But, and all of the researchers on this call will be nodding along with me, it is insane that there is no independent oversight on any of this. I mean, props to Twitter. Twitter put out a blog post last night and listed the amount of takedowns, how that had affected retweeting. That's a huge step forward, and I'm excited about it. I just would really want to see some independent analysis alongside the platforms marking their own homework. But we're getting there and it's good. But we can't keep saying these takedowns are ultimately a good thing unless we understand some of the unintended consequences of what does it mean that more people are moving to Parler this week. We need to understand what it means to have these takedowns and what it means to the wider communication ecosystem. I do think the relationship between the media and the platforms continues to be tense. And my slight frustration with that is that this relationship is one that the platforms unfortunately have benefited from the news media doing a lot of this research and investigations and ultimately becoming content moderators for the platforms. The news media are deeply frustrated with the platforms because of business model issues. But what that means is I feel like we're sort of stuck in this kind of tech clash paradigm that isn't necessarily helpful for saying, what does the public need? And instead, there's just kind of this angry relationship between the PR guys and the platforms and the disinformation journalists. But I mean, I think ultimately to Guy's point, we have to recognize there's a mixture of decreasing bad quality information and increasing quality information. And this question of who's a quality information provider, do all users believe that they're a quality information provider? I mean, back in March, there was this kind of sigh of relief from the platforms, which is, it's all right, we can hang on to the WHO. It's okay, they can make the decisions. And then as we realized that this was complex and science takes time to develop a consensus about a new virus, and unfortunately, there was a couple of missteps from some of the health authorities. Then there was a sense of, no, but we can't trust. What does it mean? I mean, this is complex. There aren't any easy solutions, but it's easy to say, increase this, decrease that. But I think, as Pietro said, the definitions of both of these are really, really woolly, again, in every different country with different media ecosystems. So, as ever, we will continue talking about these issues for years and years to come, but it's okay because there is no easy solution to this, and it's the challenge of our times, and they're very important questions.
Thank you, Claire. Well, that does bring us to Stephen, and thank you, Stephen, for you being here and Twitter itself, engaging in these issues. Now, you're director of public policy in the European Union for Twitter, and I guess you could speak a bit also from the global perspective. But tell us, I mean, how do you see your experience in the COVID and perhaps in the elections thing? What's the connection between disinformation in these spaces? What are you doing about it in general, this phenomenon, which of course impacts on other areas as well?
Great. Thank you, Guy. And thank you, everyone, for all your great contributions so far. And it's good to follow Claire, and I can see myself nodding along with many of her recommendations. And I understand the number of challenges that we're facing in this current space. And even Tina had a great quote about we're building this ship as we're trying to drive it as well. And this is really one of those areas where we're starting to feel new ground and needing some of those opportunities to try and experiment with new areas of engagement and addressing some of the new challenges that we see. But overall, from the beginning, we've seen the COVID crisis has demonstrated really the value of having an open and global internet. Well, from the positive side, having people connecting who are being stuck at home, sharing gratitude, sharing encouragement across the platform. So we have seen both the positive and the challenges side of this pandemic so far. And really what we focused on from our approach as one element of this information ecosystem, as Claire mentioned, is really focused on looking at our policies, our enforcement, our product and our services, and how that can either be potentially harmful or encouraging certain negative aspects, and looking at our partnerships and cooperation and how those can be leveraged to amplify some of the more authoritative sources on the service. And on the first part, on the enforcement,
sorry, there's a bit of an echo. I don't know if you step back a bit further.
Sure. Is that better?
Talk some more.
Is that better now?
No.
No? Oh, okay.
Do you want to switch your mic off and on again, maybe?
Is that better? Here, I'll try with the headphones.
It's not much better. I think you have the same problem that I'm having today.
Okay. Maybe I'll try this. Is that a little bit better?
A bit better, yes.
Okay. I'll try to be less echoey in my voice, maybe much more straightforward. But maybe just to follow up again on the policy and enforcement approach that we took was really based off of following some of the initial enforcement we did around banning of political ads on the service. We further expanded the rules around prohibiting ads around COVID, and then focusing on the content aspect, which was content and behavior that had the potential for causing most harm, both online and offline. And really, this was about working closely with trusted partners, governments, and organizations to flag some of these threats early on and the different trends that we were seeing, both within Europe and at a global level. So trying to better understand the cultural context that plays into it and how that information is spreading overall. Yes.
I'm so sorry. Try and switch your mic off and on, and let's try that.
Is it a little bit better?
I'm not sure. Okay, let's go again. Okay. Talk slowly.
I will try my best then. All right. But in terms of that enforcement and those efforts overall, we have removed over 20,000 tweets and challenged over 8.5 million accounts since we first launched our COVID misinformation reporting flow. And from the service side of things, and this is really where we started to work a lot more to be more proactive in this space. We started to rethink the incentives that we were providing on Twitter. So how people see, how people engage, and how people share content. So something like putting a pause in before retweeting, or putting a prompt in for when people want to share an article. What we've seen is that even putting that friction between the sharing of the article, 40% more people are reading the article before deciding to whether to share it or not. I think giving more of those areas instead of just promoting the fast track to share information as quickly as possible, or even starting to look at how we incentivize the engagement on the service, like what does the like button mean? Does that actually help encourage healthy conversations on the platform? These are things that we're starting to look into more and more now. And this kind of goes in line with providing more context and more understanding of how we're taking action on the platform, or how we're starting to be more proactive, providing more context. The labels that have been used, particularly around COVID, but also in the election context, are one of those examples to allow people to make informed decisions on the information that they encounter on the service. And I think this goes hand in hand with our approach on transparency, which is really...
Stephen?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt again, because people can't hear you so well. Maybe we'll move to the next speaker. If you log out and log back in, then I hope we'll have better audio, and then you can continue.
All right. I'll try a different
Okay. Thank you. Christina Tardagila is Associate Director of the International Fact-Checking Network. So we come, having covered a lot of ground with issues such as culture, norms, emotions, identity, we come back to this question of fact-checking. And so could you tell us, Christina, you're in this international fact-checking network, give us a sentence or two about the network, but then tell us how you've been working and what impact you see from fact-checking. Has fact-checking had the kind of impact that Stephen was talking about, that you can create more friction in the system in terms of the flow of disinformation? Over to you, Christina.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm talking to you from Tampa in Florida, so it's a bit early for me still. First, I wanted to share the great news that I just got, that the Coronavirus Facts Alliance, that the group that we put together back in January to fight COVID-19 misinformation, has just been selected by the Paris Peace Forum to be supported for 1 year, which means that the work that we've been doing together as fact checkers to fight all the hoaxes, and we have detected more than 9,000 hoaxes so far, is being highly recognized. So I was a bit late in this call because I was in the other event just learning that, and I really want to share this with you, and thank you for the support you've been putting towards fact checkers. They really need support right now. This has been a tough year, as you might know. So to your question, well, fact checkers, they definitely believe that they do have a high impact, and I can kind of tell you why. We have, based on the coronavirus facts database that we put together, it's, as I said, 9,300 hoaxes that have been debunked. We managed to identify different waves of misinformation, waves that went global, and I can detail that if you feel that's important in this call. But what we are really proud of is the fact that we managed to kill or minimize some of those waves. I'm talking about, we're no longer seeing people blaming the bat soup, right? That was global. We aren't receiving those videos and images of people fainting on supermarkets or subways. That's gone. Because I mean, there are so many other. We're no longer saying that China is burning people that are infected. These hoaxes were really big at certain moment in this year, and if I truly believe that if it wasn't for fact checkers and their attitude towards working together and fast, those hoaxes would still be around, and the misinformation environment and the disorder would be much worse. But of course, we still need a lot of research, and the database is now being shared with about 10, about, I say 10, I think it's 12, about 10 researchers that sent us a papers to use the database, and they are analyzing more information regarding the impact. So we are looking forward to having some more data regarding the impact. If that can be helpful, I'll be happy to share with you all as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you, and congratulations. I think the work that you do to coordinate these international fact-checking initiatives is super important, and they need that sharing of practice and support, because they're also under attack and they need of support. There's actually a very interesting chapter in our study, I don't know if you've read it yet, on fact-checking, what it involves, how independent is it, how it could be weaponized in some cases, and also then what the companies can do to support it. So let me ask you then, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing fact-checking at the moment? Is it the nature of the activity? Is it because you can fact-check and then people don't care about facts? Or is it that you don't have enough money? Tell us, what are your biggest challenges?
Well, right now, I believe there are a few huge challenges, to be honest. I believe the biggest challenge is the amount of misinformation. If you take a look at the fact-checking community, it's not big, to be honest. I'm Brazilian, as some of you might know, and I can just use some numbers from Brazil. Brazil has 200 million people and about 50 fact checkers. So that doesn't quite go well, right? there are lots and lots of misinformation flowing around, and they will never ever be fact checked, and they can be very, very harmful. So I'd say the amount of misinformation is a big issue in the entire planet. The second problem I'd say is the relationship or the lack of relationship with some important platforms. We do have a good relationship and a program with Facebook and Instagram, but we still don't have anything in place with Twitter, with Weibo, with Line, Kakao Talk. And there are so many, LinkedIn. How many false resumes are we seeing around the planet right now? So I believe that this would be an important move for 2021 to make sure that the platforms understand that they should work with fact checkers, because we do have a code of ethics, and that keeps us on track. So when we fight against misinformation, you have to be transparent. You have to have a methodology, and you have to have a correction policy. And I kind of fear that platforms are moving towards solving the issue of misinformation on their own, as we saw Twitter labeling some tweets in the US election with kind of no transparency on how they choose or what they do and when they do it. And also in that connected to that idea, Guy, I would say that we could and we need, as the fact-checking community, to explain to the platforms that whatever policy they put in place in the United States, it should be taken worldwide. What we're seeing is some content there, you have some policy or some enforcement that works in the United States but doesn't work anywhere else. So we need to understand that misinformation doesn't respect barriers as frontiers. So this would be a very important thing. I'm glad to say that I think for the first time, fact-checking is not out of money. This was a sad but good year for fact-checkers. But of course, we need to, as I said in the first point, to have more people fact-checking. Our teams need to grow.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we've got Stephen back. And Stephen, let's see if the audio works better now.
All right, I've changed venues. Is that better?
I think so.
Perfect. All right, we'll see how it goes. I only have so many rooms in my apartment, so we don't need a whole tour of everything. But I will pick up.
It is still echoing somewhat. I'm sorry, but speak slowly, and then we'll try and follow.
All right. Perfect. Okay. Well, I'll pick up on one of the points that Christina raised around transparency as well, and this has been at the heart of Twitter's approach across the board. And this is embodied by our open APIs, our information operations database disclosures, and it's really to ensure that we're providing enough information and resources to researchers and developers to provide context and feedback on the public conversation that we see on the service. And COVID highlighted a lot of these challenges, and was really why we started to present a COVID blog post with updates on our policies and all the efforts and enforcement that we were taking. But also creating a free API endpoint, so researchers and developers could access tens of millions of tweets a day to understand the discussion around COVID and how it was transcending borders and taking place both within their own countries and globally. But this is also amplified through our work and our partnerships in close cooperation with trusted partners, but also government agencies, international organizations like the WHO and UNESCO, working through ensuring that we're bringing forward authoritative information. We've done so much work around disinformation and campaigns on the service, both within the Commission and UNESCO around media literacy and conspiracy theories. And recently, obviously, supporting UNESCO and NGO partners with a grant of 200,000 euros, which we know will continue to help encourage greater efforts and greater initiatives around this space. So there's a lot of work that we're doing both within ourselves as Twitter and working with the external partners to ensure that we're trying to address the societal approach to this societal challenge, and playing our role as part of one actor in this ecosystem that we are all trying to address. And I think all the other speakers touched upon it quite well, but I'll leave the rest of my time for questions and everything else. So thank you for that, guys.
Okay, thank you. I hope my mic is working okay. There is a vibrant chat going on, and there's some Q&A. So please, if I can ask people to join both of those as we continue. We have, I think, about 15 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to just sum up what do you think is the #1 issue related to internet governance that you take away from this discussion and the issue of disinformation around COVID? So, Julie, what's the #1 issue? Internet governance. Let me say, remembering that internet governance is a question of norms, principles, programs, practices in the field of a lot of different actors in the particular roles that they play.
Yes, indeed. I would highlight, however, that I think as per a report that was published that I consulted on earlier this week by the Information and Democracy Forum, the onus is and needs to be to a large extent on the platforms, because it is a result of the newly structured information ecosystem in which we live that we have this crisis in the first instance. Virality has arrived, and that is what has weaponized disinformation to the biggest extent. And I would caution against news organizations and platforms working more closely in an uncritical sense. And I would highlight the need for extreme transparency and governance, independent governance of funding of various programs and interventions. I don't think we can take our eyes off that. And that's something that friend and colleague Maria Ressa would insist on me highlighting as the individual case study in all of these issues converging in a very cataclysmic way. So I would say that, but also to say that that does not preclude collaboration that is done with all of those caveats in place. And I do want to give kudos to Stephen Turner for turning up here despite your audio issues, Stephen. We need good faith and transparency and a seat at the table from the platforms. And I've personally, and from a research perspective, been impressed with what Twitter has attempted to do, particularly in the context of the US election disinformation that we're seeing. This study was also overseen to an extent through their role on the Broadband Commission by Facebook, but Facebook is not at this table. So I think it's important in the interest of transparency and with an eye to governance to highlight that that fact, and there needs to be, trust between the various actors in these processes. But the other important point I'd just like to briefly highlight has been said several times. I think we must try to secure and support independent critical journalism as much as we possibly can in the context of internet governance. How do we enable it to be better surfaced? How do we insist upon funding mechanisms that support journalism as a potential bulwark? Yes, there are many other actors, many other information providers, but what we're seeing through an erosion of this kind of critical journalism and its role as a pillar of democracy is a mess and a tsunami of information and disinformation. So I just want to end with that point. There's been a lot of rich and interesting interventions here that we can take away, but I do want to underline those two things. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Tina, 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to bring in the health perspective to this. Health is a human right. And people have the right to seek and access information about their health. So, the way that we think about this in public health is, people have the right to be scared. They are concerned in the middle of a pandemic, which can also lead to, sharing of low quality information. But it's really the job of health authorities to offer health services to mitigate the health impact of the pandemic and to provide accurate information and address the needs of their populations. Now, what does that mean for internet governance? What would a healthy information environment look like? And I would, really think about this weighing that Claire mentioned earlier. We need to find a way of fostering both more access to high quality health information, at the same time slowing the spread of mis and disinformation. So really we should be thinking, and I don't have easy answers here, what is the equivalent of 2 meters of social distance online? And we really need to try and find the answers to this question. And I really feel research and transparency and really measuring the effects of, you know, everything that we're trying to do is really critical. So I underscore also what Julie was saying earlier. So we really need transparency and research and trust in order to be able to work together.
Super. Vivian.
Yeah, I actually want to echo something that Tina said, because information is one of children's rights. And I think that I was misunderstood by one of the attendees as I was suggesting that kids be pushed offline. I don't think they should be pushed offline. I think they should be invited in. And I absolutely agree. We need a few more roadblocks to bad information and a little bit more supersonic good information. But obviously we can talk about what good and bad is. I actually think at a governance level, we got to have independent oversight. I think that if the companies are lending their network effect to these forms of disinformation that were set out so well at the beginning by Julie, and many of them are, you know, are avoidable. You've got to ask yourself the question, which is, you know, are they fit for purpose if they lend their network effect to something that is creating a health crisis, a crisis in democracy, a crisis in childhood, and so on? I think you got to ask some big questions. So absolutely the platforms have a role to play. And I do shout out to Twitter for some of the moves they've made recently. You know, it's been really interesting watching that happen. But I think that there was one thing that I will argue with, and Pietro is used to me arguing with him. He said something about everywhere is different and every country is different. But have you noticed that the problems are very similar? Because we're all using the same platforms, right? And I think we just got to concentrate on that bit. We got to say there is a new kid in town, and we need that kid to grow up a little. And I don't think if we don't get that, you know, in our sights, it's too big for us.
Wonderful. Quite.
Vivian, you are absolutely right. The thing is that that we obviously have same problems because we are human, but we are also very different because we are humans. And then I stop at that because I'm just looking forward to the time when we sit together over a glass of wine and just debate this, because it's a major philosophical issue. And somebody who follows Karl Marx would see things different than from somebody who follows, I don't know, von Hayek or Smith or whoever. Now, to reply to the question about this effect of the current situation on internet governance. There's a person in the audience, sorry for pronouncing the name, Humiara Rabab, who asked a question, is COVID a catalyst for disinformation? So to stay within this chemistry metaphor, I would say it's not a catalyst, it's just a fuel. Disinformation has been with us for ages and will be with us. It's just a fuel. However, I do hope, and this is replying the question about the internet governance, that it's a catalyst for debate about internet, about technology and the role in the society, because this internet has been a relatively new phenomenon for all of us, and this is probably, leaving aside, you know, armed conflicts and so on, this is probably the first major crisis that internet is such a big part of, not so much creating the crisis, but sometimes accelerating it, sometimes helping fighting it. And I hope that we will continue the debate, and from the public policy standpoint and from organization of our society standpoint, we will try, when this whole thing is over and everybody's healthy, and even before that, that we try to come up with some set, not only recommendations like we did with the study, but also with actual complex policies to, not to solve everything, because this is impossible, but to understand the phenomenon that internet is and the governance of it even more.
And Claire, your turn. Internet governance and what we've been discussing.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, I think there's there's a kind of a drumbeat that we need regulation, and people keep saying that. My fear is that we still have almost no knowledge of the scale of misinformation and the impact of misinformation. And so without that, we shouldn't be thinking about regulation until we have more understanding. And I'd say for the last 3 years, academics have just been on the same bandwagon of like, we need the data, we need the data, we need the data. And the platforms get saying, well, what specific data? And we're like, well, it's complex, but we mostly just need the data. Well, there's consent questions there. And I'm not saying that I'm completely in the platform's position. We need data. But I also think from a researcher perspective, we just need to be much more innovative about the kind of research questions we're asking, think much more qualitatively, and stop believing that unless we have huge data sets, there's nothing we can do. And so we've just been doing some research with a partnership on AI, asking people in the field to make a note and a diary, essentially, every time they come across a piece of problematic content and the flag that they see on Facebook. It will not surprise any of you to hear that there are not uniform responses to seeing flags on Facebook. People on the right get very, very angry, and it drives down trust more generally. People on the left absolutely love it. But there's no easy way here. But the thing that I came away from that research is the process of asking people to reflect on this in itself became a tool of information literacy, because people were forced to think, is this the kind of content that I would like to see or not see? How do I feel about it being flagged? Like, there's a million research questions that we should be asking. We should be auditing. What is it that people see? Christina's absolutely right. There's a lot of this stuff out there, but what she's seeing in her feed versus me, how is it different on different? I mean, we just know almost nothing about what people are actually seeing, which is why we're jumping up and down about Stephen's blog post yesterday, which just should be the bare minimum. So I think internet governance, yes, there's a lot we need to do, but we have to build an empirical foundation, and we can't just keep like being stuck in this, we need the data. We need to think of other, more qualitative, working with the community to ask them about what they're seeing, because that process actually will do a really important job of getting the public to be part of this conversation about the types of information they want to see and how they want to see it handled. So it's just a call for more qualitative research. Won't surprise people on this call.
Well, I think you're also calling for the public to become stakeholders in internet governance here as well. So, Christina.
Well, first, I completely agree with Claire. I mean, she's just awesome, keeps being awesome day after day. But I'd like to raise four topics very quickly, if I have that time. First, the IFCN is, until this moment, completely against any type of regulation to fight misinformation. And we say that based on a database that we've been building since 2018. We have been tracking the efforts that are being done to fight mis and disinfo in 60 countries. And what we see so far is kind of sad. First is that no country has managed to fight misinformation, and it can't serve as a benchmark for the planet, so we don't have that. So no one is successful. Number two is that those countries that have moved towards legislation, they have, that's mainly in Asia, they have now created other problems without solving misinfo and disinfo. They have created censorship, they have created internet shutdowns, they have created fact-checking organizations by the government, and they are arresting people. So that's a bit dangerous, and we don't see that as a solution. Going back to our other fellows talked about human rights, and I say education is one of them, and I truly believe that's the path. I mean, I can't believe that my daughter, who is 11 years old, goes to middle school and does not have a fact-checking or a media literacy class. And I'm in the United States, just picture a bit how it works in Brazil, 0, 0, 0. And that would be something that I would like to push governments to think about. I mean, everybody hates fake news, everybody hates disinformation, but what are they actually doing to prevent the next generation to have to do what we're doing here, is try to come up with solutions. They do have a solution. They have to teach fact-checking and media literacy as they teach math. I mean, it's just, that's the best way. The other idea is, I have been thinking a bit about two topics, like the role that media is playing in all of this, clickbaits versus good stories. So I really believe that we could start talking about a disinformation editor. That role isn't around. I don't know any organization, any media outlet that has a disinformation editor, somebody that says, hey, this headline doesn't look good, or this photo needs a label that says it's false, or whatever. I mean, we really need that the media gets this person or some of them to review whatever they are published. And the latest is that I would love, since I saw Social Dilemma, that documentary that's very, for me, very crazy. But I'm wondering, like, what if those guys got everyone in the planet addicted to social media, could they get together with us and make people addicted to facts? Like they know how to make people addicted. So maybe what if we got them all in a room and say, let's brainstorm about how to use platforms to get people addicted to facts. So I've been running around these two ideas. Sorry for talking too much.
Thank you so much. And just one comment in regard to what you said about regulation. Indeed, from UNESCO, we are seeing that often regulation that's introduced supposedly to stop lies is in fact ended up to stop truth. So regulation is a very complicated issue. Now let's just have a word from Stephen, and then we'll have to wrap up. So Stephen, over to you.
I will do my best to be less echoey and succinct. But no, I agree with a lot of what has been said. I think there's a few elements to highlight, and I think Peter touched on this as well in his intro on legislation, is that we have a number of these issues are being built, and a lot of the solutions are being built off the back of one or two or three services or platforms. Like we need more people at the table, more ideas and more solutions, and we have to find a way to build that long game into our approach. And in this sense, every time it comes to content, we always see the desire to build walls to the flow of information. And we want to ensure that there continues to be an open and cooperative flow of information and knowledge across borders. And as it's been mentioned, it has to be authoritative, it has to be meaningful information. We want to ensure that we're addressing the harmful disinformation aspect and trying to raise more of this authoritative information. And I think generally it's about building this digital resilience, and the role for Twitter in that respect, as has been said, how do we become more transparent? How do we give more sunlight into what we're doing and explainability to both the users, but also civil society, so they can tell the story and explain more of how these services are impacting people's lives. And I think we're trying to do more in terms of just giving the information to the users and to people so they can make credible and informed decisions on how they share and interact with information. And I think the cooperation aspect, and I agree with Julie in respect that the role of journalists is to be journalists. They shouldn't have to also deal with everything else that comes down the plate. But I think there's a lot more cooperation that needs to be done in this space, where if we are taking efforts to, for example, remove or flag content, and then that content is spread without the label or without any notification on a news network or on a broadcast, that doesn't help the efforts and continues to give air to something that is probably problematic. So I think there's more collaboration in that space, but also working together and trying to address this as a society and trying to put all the pieces together. So thank you again for the great opportunity, and looking forward to more discussions.
Thank you, Stephen. So the great thing about IGF is that it is a multi-stakeholder engagement, and I think we've had a lot of stakeholders here, except for young people, but they were ably represented, I think, by DBAN. And next time we will have young people, I think, as stakeholders in our multi-stakeholder dialogue. Thank you, everybody. That was so interesting, and I think go ahead, read the study. Be in touch with us. We'd love to keep up this dialogue, and there will be many more of these kinds of engagements. So thanks also to the IGF technical people for letting us run over for 2 minutes. I hope you found it useful. I'm sorry we didn't address all the questions in the Q&A, but I think you've still got your money's worth in terms of the time you spent with us. Thank you, dear panelists, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Stay healthy and informed.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So it's only 2 of us. But I guess this is it. Thank you so much for being my co-host. This was nice.
Thank you, Norman. Let's connect soon.
Right, bye. We connect offline, the other side.